MDB, Malaysia's $4.5 billion sovereign wealth fund heist. In the glittering ballrooms of Beverly Hills and the exclusive penthouses of Manhattan, Hollywood's elite celebrated the success of The Wolf of Wall Street, a film ironically about financial fraud that was itself financed with stolen billions. The money that funded Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal of Jordan Belfort came from one of the most audacious sovereign wealth fund heists in history, a scheme so brazen it would eventually topple the Malaysian government that created it. This is the story of One Malaysia Development Berhad, known as 1MDB, a state investment fund established in 2009 with the noble purpose of transforming Malaysia into a developed nation through strategic investments. Instead, it became the vehicle for what the U.S. Department of Justice called the largest kleptocracy case in American history, with over $4.5 billion siphoned from the Malaysian people into the private accounts of political elites, their associates, and a flamboyant financier who convinced the world he was the next Warren Buffett. The mastermind behind this elaborate web of deception was Jho Low, a portly Malaysian businessman whose real name was Low Taik Jho, who despite having no official position at 1MDB, wielded enormous influence over its operations and investment decisions. Low's schemes were so sophisticated and far-reaching that they involved fake documents, shell companies across multiple jurisdictions, forged correspondence from Middle Eastern royalty, and a network of international banks that either turned a blind eye to obvious red flags or actively participated in the money laundering operations. The origins of this massive fraud trace back to the relationship between Jho Low and Najib Razak, who became Malaysia's prime minister in 2009 and simultaneously served as chairman of 1MDB's board of advisors, giving him ultimate authority over the fund's strategic direction and major transactions. Low had cultivated this relationship since their first meeting in 2006, presenting himself as a well-connected international financier with access to Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds and the ability to structure complex deals that would benefit Malaysia. When Najib established 1MDB in 2009 with an initial capitalization of 1 million Malaysian ringgit, Low positioned himself as an unofficial advisor who could help the fund achieve its ambitious goals of raising billions for infrastructure development, energy projects, and other strategic investments. The fund's stated mission was to pursue global partnerships and promote foreign direct investment to transform Malaysia into a high-income developed nation by 2020, but from its very inception, Low and his co-conspirators began designing structures that would allow them to divert funds for personal use. The first major fraudulent transaction occurred in 2009 when 1MDB entered into a joint venture with Petro-Saudi International, supposedly to develop oil concessions in Argentina and other countries. Low fabricated correspondence from Saudi Prince Turki bin Abdullah Al Saud and created fake documents to make it appear that Petro-Saudi was backed by the Saudi government, when in reality it was controlled by Low's associate Tariq Obaid and had no legitimate oil assets. Through this fraudulent joint venture, $1 billion was transferred from 1MDB to Petro-Saudi accounts. But immediately after the transfer, $700 million was diverted to a Swiss bank account controlled by Low, marking the beginning of the systematic looting of the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund. The scale and sophistication of the 1MDB fraud expanded dramatically in 2012 and 2013 through a series of fraudulent bond issuances that were arranged by Goldman Sachs, which earned approximately $600 million in fees for its role in the transactions, far exceeding normal market rates for such deals. The first major bond issuance occurred in March 2012, when 1MDB raised $1.75 billion ostensibly to fund energy projects, but within hours of the money arriving in 1MDB's accounts, over $1.4 billion was transferred to offshore shell companies controlled by Low and his associates. Goldman Sachs managing director Tim Leissner, who led the bank's relationship with 1MDB, received millions in kickbacks and bonuses tied to these transactions, while his colleague Roger Ng helped facilitate the money laundering through various international banks. The second fraudulent bond deal occurred in May 2012, raising another $1.75 billion, that was supposedly designated for power plant acquisitions and other energy infrastructure projects in Malaysia. But again, the vast majority of the proceeds were immediately diverted to Low's network of shell companies. The most brazen theft occurred with the third bond issuance in March 2013, when 1MDB raised $3 billion through Goldman Sachs, with the stated purpose of acquiring energy assets from Abar Investments, a sovereign wealth fund controlled by the government of Abu Dhabi. Low and his co-conspirators created a fake entity called Abar Investments PJS Limited that was designed to be confused with the legitimate Abar Fund, and approximately $1.4 billion from the bond proceeds was transferred to accounts controlled by this shell company rather than the real Abar. Throughout these transactions, Low paid hundreds of millions in bribes and kickbacks to ensure the cooperation of Malaysian officials, Goldman Sachs bankers, and other intermediaries who facilitated the money laundering. The stolen 1MDB funds fueled an extraordinary spending spree that spanned continents and industries, with Low using the money to purchase luxury real estate, fine art, jewelry, and to finance Hollywood films through his entertainment company Red Granite Pictures. Low's most visible investments were in the entertainment industry, where he provided financing for major Hollywood productions, including The Wolf of Wall Street, which received $100 million in funding from Red Granite Pictures, and Daddy's Home, starring Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg. Red Granite Pictures was co-founded by Riza Aziz, who was the stepson of Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, creating a direct family connection between the stolen funds and the highest levels of the Malaysian government. Low used 1MDB money to purchase the Park Lane Hotel in New York for $660 million, a $250 million super yacht called the Equanimity that featured a helicopter pad and movie theater, and luxury properties in Beverly Hills, Manhattan, and London worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The art purchases were equally extravagant, including works by Pablo Picasso, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Claude Monet, with one Basquiat painting alone costing $93.2 million of stolen 1MDB funds. Low also used the money to throw lavish parties attended by celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, Paris Hilton, and Miranda Kerr, often flying dozens of guests on private jets to exotic locations and spending millions on a single evening's entertainment. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Najib Razak received at least $681 million in 1MDB funds that were transferred directly to his personal bank accounts, money that he used to purchase luxury items, fund political campaigns, and maintain his grip on power in Malaysia. The international nature of the 1MDB fraud required the participation of numerous banks and financial institutions that either willfully ignored obvious red flags or failed to implement adequate anti-money laundering controls to detect the suspicious transactions. Deutsche Bank played a crucial role in the money laundering scheme by processing hundreds of millions in 1MDB-related transfers through its correspondent banking relationships, despite clear warning signs that the funds were proceeds of corruption and fraud. BSI Bank, a Swiss private bank, was eventually shut down by Swiss regulators after investigations revealed that it had processed over $1.2 billion in 1MDB-related funds while ignoring numerous compliance violations and suspicious activity reports from its own staff. Standard Chartered Bank processed hundreds of millions in 1MDB transfers through its branches in Singapore, Malaysia, and other jurisdictions, with some bank employees allegedly receiving bribes to facilitate the transactions and avoid reporting requirements. The laundering network also involved smaller banks and financial institutions in jurisdictions like Singapore, Switzerland, and Luxembourg that provided banking services to Low's shell companies without conducting adequate due diligence on the source of funds. J.P. Morgan Chase processed over $1 billion in 1MDB-related transfers through its correspondent banking network, including funds that were used to purchase the Park Lane Hotel and other luxury assets in the United States. The complexity of the money laundering scheme was enhanced by the use of multiple currency conversions, back-to-back transactions that obscured the original source of funds, and the creation of dozens of shell companies with similar names that were designed to confuse regulators and compliance officers at various financial institutions. The 1MDB scandal began to unravel in 2015 when investigative journalists, particularly Claire Rucastle-Brown of the Sarawak Report, began publishing detailed exposés of the fund's suspicious transactions and the lavish lifestyle being funded by Low and his associates. The Wall Street Journal published a series of groundbreaking articles that traced $681 million in 1MDB funds directly to Prime Minister Najib's personal bank accounts, providing documentary evidence of the highest-level corruption in the Malaysian government. Swiss authorities opened criminal investigations in 2015 after banks in their jurisdiction reported suspicious transactions totaling over $4 billion related to 1MDB, leading to the freezing of numerous accounts and the eventual shutdown of BSI Bank. Singapore's Monetary Authority launched its own investigation and ultimately fined several banks, imprisoned multiple bankers, and closed the local operations of BSI Bank and Falcon Private Bank for their roles in the money laundering scheme. The U.S. Department of Justice filed its first civil forfeiture complaint in July 2016, seeking to recover over $1 billion in assets purchased with stolen 1MDB funds, including the Park Lane Hotel, luxury real estate, artwork, and jewelry located in the United States. These legal actions provided unprecedented detail about the fraud scheme, naming Low, Najib, and dozens of other co-conspirators, while tracing the exact flow of funds from 1MDB through various shell companies to the ultimate beneficiaries. Malaysian authorities initially denied any wrongdoing and claimed that the funds in Najib's accounts were legitimate political donations from Saudi Arabia. But this explanation became increasingly implausible as more evidence emerged of the systematic looting of the sovereign wealth fund. The political consequences of the 1MDB scandal were as dramatic as the financial crimes themselves, ultimately leading to the downfall of Prime Minister Najib Razak and his political party's first electoral defeat since Malaysia's independence in 1957. As evidence of the fraud became public through international investigations and media reports, Malaysian civil society groups organized massive protests demanding Najib's resignation and calling for accountability for the stolen funds. Mahathir Mohamad, who had previously served as Prime Minister from 1981 to 2003, came out of retirement at age 92. To lead the opposition coalition against Najib, with the 1MDB scandal serving as the central issue in the 2018 general election campaign. The electoral defeat of Najib's ruling coalition in May 2018 was historic, marking the first time since independence that the United Malays National Organization had lost power, and the new government immediately reopened investigations into 1MDB and filed criminal charges against Najib and other officials involved in the fraud. Within months of the election, Malaysian authorities arrested Najib and charged him with multiple counts of criminal breach of trust, money laundering, and abuse of power related to his receipt of 1MDB funds, while also seeking to recover billions in stolen assets through civil forfeiture actions. The new government's investigations revealed that the total amount stolen from 1MDB was even larger than initially estimated, with some officials claiming that over $4.5 billion had been diverted from the fund for personal use by various conspirators. International cooperation in the recovery efforts led to the seizure of Low's superyacht, luxury real estate, artwork, and other assets in multiple jurisdictions, though Low himself remained a fugitive and was believed to be hiding in China under the protection of Chinese authorities. The criminal prosecutions and civil recovery efforts that followed the exposure of the 1MDB fraud resulted in unprecedented penalties for the financial institutions and individuals involved in the money laundering scheme. Goldman Sachs ultimately paid over $2.9 billion in penalties to U.S. and Malaysian authorities and admitted that it had violated anti-corruption laws in connection with the 1MDB bond deals, while also agreeing to pay an additional $1.4 billion to Malaysia as part of a settlement agreement. Tim Leissner, the former Goldman Sachs managing director, pleaded guilty to conspiracy and money laundering charges and was sentenced to prison after cooperating with prosecutors and paying millions in forfeiture, while his colleague Roger Ng was convicted at trial and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Najib Razak was convicted on 7 criminal charges related to a subsidiary of 1MDB and sentenced to 12 years in prison plus a $50 million fine, though he remained free pending appeal and continued to maintain his innocence while claiming he was unaware that the funds in his accounts came from 1MDB. Red Granite Pictures agreed to pay $60 million to settle civil forfeiture claims related to its financing with stolen 1MDB funds, including the money used to produce The Wolf of Wall Street, creating the ironic situation where a movie about financial fraud was itself financed with proceeds of one of the largest financial frauds in history. The U.S. Department of Justice ultimately recovered over $1.7 billion in stolen 1MDB assets through its civil forfeiture program, including luxury real estate, artwork, jewelry, and other items that were sold with the proceeds returned to the Malaysian people. Multiple other countries, including Switzerland, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, also recovered hundreds of millions in 1MDB-related assets and returned them to Malaysia as part of international cooperation efforts to combat kleptocracy and money laundering. The 1MDB scandal stands as one of the most significant sovereign wealth fund frauds in history, demonstrating how corrupt officials can exploit state-owned investment vehicles to enrich themselves while impoverishing their own people and undermining global financial systems. The total amount stolen from 1MDB is estimated at over $4.5 billion, money that was supposed to be used for development projects that would have improved the lives of millions of Malaysians, but instead funded Hollywood movies, luxury yachts, and extravagant parties for a small group of connected individuals. The case revealed critical weaknesses in the international banking system, where major financial institutions either ignored obvious red flags or actively facilitated money laundering in pursuit of lucrative fees from high-risk clients like 1MDB and Jho Low's network of shell companies. The sophisticated nature of the fraud, involving fake documents, forged correspondence, shell companies across multiple jurisdictions, and the corruption of officials at the highest levels of government, illustrates the challenges that law enforcement faces in combating modern financial crimes that transcend national borders. However, the ultimate exposure and prosecution of the 1MDB conspirators also demonstrates the power of investigative journalism, international law enforcement cooperation, and civil society activism in holding corrupt officials accountable even when they control the levers of state power. The electoral defeat of Najib Razak and his political party shows that even in countries with limited democratic traditions, voters will ultimately reject leaders who steal from the public treasury for personal enrichment. As Jho Low remains a fugitive and billions in stolen assets continue to be recovered through international cooperation, the 1MDB case serves as both a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities of sovereign wealth funds to insider fraud and a demonstration that no one, regardless of their position or connections, is above the law when it comes to financial crimes of this magnitude. The scandal's impact extends far beyond Malaysia, influencing global discussions about transparency and sovereign wealth funds, the responsibilities of international banks in preventing money laundering, and the importance of press freedom and civil society in exposing corruption at the highest levels of government.